quickly go over how to create a core data model with an Xcode project so we can have a database. So for this, I'm just going to start off with a single view application. Click Next. We'll call it our core data tests. You can see I've checked use core data. I'm going to do this in Objective-C. Click Next. We'll just save it somewhere. Now you can see it's added this Xcode data model down here. The first thing we're going to do is add an entity. Just click plus entity. I can double click on this and change the entity's name. We'll just change it to test entity. For right now, I can add an attribute. We'll call it name, and I need to give it a type, which we'll call string. Now I've started that process of creating that test entity. I can create a second entity and then call it second entity. You can think of these entities like tables. Second entity, now we can say we want that to be address, and we're going to give it a string and say it's of string, type string. Now I've created that whole model, and now I need to actually do something with it. So they've already put in some boilerplate code for us in our app delegate. And you can see some of this stuff is put in there about the persistent store coordinator, the model, the applications directory, and even the managed object context. And we won't go into all of these things today because we're just doing a basic brief overview of how to create an entity, add something to it, and be able to retrieve it. So the first thing I need to do is I need to do an ns managed object context. We'll call it context, and we're going to set equal to self managed object context. You can see down at the bottom down here, we're creating a persistent store and returning the managed object context. Now that we have the context, we can do an ns managed object. We're just going to call this test entity. We're going to set that equal to ns entity description, and then we're going to say insert new object for entity name into context. Then we're going to come back to our data model and figure out, we'll just call it test entity. We'll put in there our test entity. Test entity then we need to be able to set a value. So we're going to test entity, set value. We're going to call it test name. For key, we would call it name. Double check. On our test entity, we called it name, and it's of type string, which is perfect. That's what we've got. So the next thing we need to do, now that we've got that, we're going to do an ns error, and then we're going to do a if there's not context, save, and error. So it's going to try and save it. If there is an error, then it needs to print out something that says save failed. Now we can add to this all day, but the next thing we want to be able to do is do an ns fetch request. So this request is going to fetch from our database. ns fetch request, we're going to allocate it and initialize it. And then we're going to do an ns entity description. We're going to call it entity equals ns entity description, entity for name. And then we're going to grab this test entity. We're going to give it our context. And then we're going to do a request set entity, and then we're going to get our objects back. So we're going to have an array of objects. We're going to call those our fetched objects, and that's going to be equal to our context, which is going to execute our fetch request, which is just request, with our error, which should be and error. Then we can do an ns log here. Put a breakpoint. Now when we build and run this, we'll be able to see build, we run, we come down here, and we're able to see that fetched objects contains one object. We do a printout, and we can see that the name is test name. We can see data, we can see all of our information about where it's stored. If I run it again, it's going to add another one in there, and then I should have fetched objects have 2 objects in there, which it does now because these are 2 different objects. So you can see all of that information is returning back just as it should. We can then use that information where we need to in order to facilitate more usage. Now with our Xcode data model, we could come in here and change our editor style, and then we could do something where we click Control and drag over. This will set up a relationship for us. We can call this our second relationship and our test relationship. We can go in there and we can create a second entity. This one we would call our second entity. And it has address as its attribute. So we'll call this address. Now we could do the exact same thing, but one thing we need to do now is we need to set test entity, set value, second entity, for key, whatever the relationship's name was. On test entity, it's called second relationship. And then on second entity, set value, and this will be test entity for key test relationship. Now when we create this the next time, we'll be able to see that this new one actually has a relationship. So we should see a slightly different information for this one test entity. Now we see down here, oh, we've got a crash for some reason. Oh, it's because we changed our data model out from under our app. So we need to actually go in here, delete our data, and then run it again. Now we come in here, we've got our fetched objects. We have new objects, but now you can see that there's a relationship there with a second entity, and we can be able to access that information from the second entity and use it where we need to. This is just a basic understanding of how core data works. It works a lot like a database. It is a database. It's some helper methods built upon an SQLite database. And this can help us though as we need to store data and access data within our applications.